So that was from our colleague and good friend Rainer Sauerborn, who's a visiting professor from Heidelberg. He'll be moderating the next panel, but visiting professor here at the T.H. Chan School of Public Health. As a way to do a couple of things. One is to create one framing that Rainer has been pushing on linking climate and health in a much more positive way than the devastation that is going to befall all of us if we don't get going on climate. It was also an opportunity to give 4 minutes to our two speakers to try to get some food in before the panel started. And let me quickly introduce both of them, and then we're actually going to go on to letting them each speak. Jerry Taylor is the founding director of the Niskanen Center. Started just a couple of years ago, and before that he was for 23 years at the Cato Institute, really the premier libertarian think tank in the US that has also been quite active in pushing against the science of climate change. And I've heard of Jerry for a while, but I had a chance to see him at the Atlanta meeting and immediately thought we have to figure out a way to get him up here to Harvard to talk to us a bit about his own thinking and evolution in his thinking, but really to get some advice about how we communicate more effectively to people who don't begin in the same place that we do. And that, I think, has been a big failure on our part, and I think we all have to do a much better job. And I think we got a bit of the sense of that from Gina. Let me introduce our second speaker, Anneliese Depoux, who's a co-director of the Center for Virchow-Villerme in Paris and at the Sorbonne, and has a doctorate in communication and information science, and has been really thinking about this issue of communication, engagement with the media, engagement with broader society around issues of climate. And so what we're going to do, so two very different perspectives from two different sides of the pond. I thought maybe we'd begin with Jerry, and then we'll move on to Anneliese, and then we'll have questions and discussion. So, Jerry.
Okay, good. Thank you. I'm sorry I don't have any slides. I've long thought that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely, so I'll stay away from that. It seems to me that when it comes to the challenges in communication, we have two audiences and two tasks before us as climate realists. We need to increase the saliency of climate change with people who already accept that it's happening, already accept IPCC narratives, who already accept mainstream science. But as we know, the number of people in public opinion surveys who believe that climate change is a significant risk that is up there at the very top of the things we need to be concerned about in policy and politics is rather low. So our job is to increase the immediacy and the saliency of climate change as a political and policy issue for those who are already in agreement with everything that we say here. The second challenge we have is to reduce the number and the political power of those who are skeptical about the science of climate change, who resist the calls for action, and who are not particularly convinced that the issues that we're wrestling with are altogether real. And that is, in many ways, an even more daunting task, and that's what I'm going to talk about, how to deal with that second category of challenges that we have. Let me start by telling you a little story. The Pew Research Center in May 2015 surveyed Republicans, and they asked them if they thought that trade agreements that the United States had entered into over the past several decades has been good for the country. And in May of 2015, 51% of Republicans said yes, trade agreements and free trade is good for America. And only 39% said that they were bad for the country. Pew asked that question again in August of 2016. Now, what has changed? In May of 2015, Donald Trump had just announced his candidacy for presidency of the United States. And by August of 2016, he had secured that nomination. Pew asked the same question of Republicans. Do you think trade agreements have been good for the country? 68% of Republicans this time said no, trade agreements have been bad for the country. And only 24% said that they were good for the country. So what's the takeaway here? That Republicans are sheep? No, that's not what I mean to say. I want to be very clear. Public opinion, whether we're talking about in the Democratic Party or in the Republican Party or amongst liberals or conservatives or progressives or what have you, Public opinion is driven by tribal political leaders. And the higher up the food chain they are, the more influence they have. And if you want to read a little bit about this after the conference, I'd recommend a book by Gabriel Lentz called Follow the Leader, How Voters Respond to Politicians' Policies and Performance, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2013. This is not a particularly heterodox thing to say for those who are familiar with the political science literature. We know that voters are easily moved by their political champions. And we know that what they tend to do is they adopt their political champions and then accept the policy and political narratives offered by their political champions. They don't go shopping for someone who's closest to them in ideology or policy. It works quite the opposite way around. So the point I'm trying to make here to set up this conversation about how to talk to climate skeptics is that telling stories to political partisans that are at odds with what they're hearing from their trusted political elites is to swim against an extremely strong tide. It is very, very difficult to apply even the best of the sociological and the psychological literature about what arguments in climate change work, which don't work so well with different communities, in isolation, when you're working against a backdrop in which everything they're hearing from people who they applaud and they champion and they support is entirely in the opposite direction. So, what explains changes in public opinion on climate? Because if you look at the data, you'll see that there's been a lot of movement in how Americans feel about climate change. If you look at that data, you'll find that public opinion on climate change and changes in them are all about changes in Republican opinion. Democratic opinion about climate change and liberal opinion about climate change has been relatively steady over the past 25 years. It doesn't move around very much. We've already won the argument with that crowd that climate change is real and demands policy answers, even if it's not quite as salient as we'd like. But regression analyses show that what explains that movement in Republican opinion is not whether we had a Hurricane Sandy, not whether Al Gore had a new movie or a new book or won a Nobel Prize, not whether the IPCC issued a report that year, not whether we had a hot weather event, not whether the Koch Industries or other fossil fuel actors spent a lot of money that year, not on how well the economy is done. There's always been a narrative that when the economy is doing well, people are more willing to invest in climate action when the economy is doing poorly. None of that explains changes in Republican opinion according to the regressions. What changes Republican opinion is what Republican leaders are saying about climate change. The best academic in this area, though there's been a number of good studies, is Robert Bruhl, who's a sociologist at Drexel University. You know, and sometimes we can forget how powerful Republican political leadership can be at moving the Republican base. And Donald Trump is one example. I can give you a raft of other examples in the literature, but to keep it on climate change for a minute, it's easy to forget that less than 10 years ago, the Republican Party nominated for the presidency a man who believed that climate change is real, demanded decarbonization with market forces, and who put forward a plan to do so, which was every bit, if not more aggressive than the failed Waxman-Markey initiative in 2009. And the Republican Party drafted a platform at its 2008 convention when dealing with climate change and energy policy that quite literally could have been written by Sheldon Whitehouse or Hillary Clinton. That was less than a decade ago. So now my point here is that when Republicans like John McCain, back when Newt Gingrich talked about this issue as, you know, he was in favor of a cap and trade, did commercials with Nancy Pelosi on television, that had a real impact on Republican opinion. A lot of things have changed since then, but we can get into that in the Q&A if you want. That's not directly part of my talk. But there's a puzzle here. The Yale Program on Climate Change Communications, which is one of the best shops around on this topic, issued a report in February, and despite this, they found that 49% of Trump voters say climate change is happening, only 30% say not. 62% of Trump voters support taxing or regulating greenhouse gas emissions. 62%. I'm going to remind you, that's the Bernie Sanders position. That's the Sheldon Whitehouse position. Also happens to be the Niskanen Center position, so I can be happy with that result. And 48% of Trump supporters support a revenue-neutral carbon tax. All right. So how do we explain this? I've just told you that Republicans follow their political champions. I've just explained how Donald Trump can move a party on the most fundamental things, like whether the Iraq War was worthwhile, whether George W. Bush should be locked up or something to that effect. And yet, we don't see that Trump has had much impact on the Republican base. So why would that be? The answer is radical voter ignorance. Now, only about very few people really pay that much attention to politics. And we often overstate how much they're really paying attention. Most Trump voters don't know where Donald Trump falls out on climate, believe it or not. Did you know that only about half of the American voters can tell you which is the pro-life and pro-choice party? I mean, that's one of the most emotional issues in American politics. Climate change being a low salience issue that people don't care that much about, even if they say, yeah, I guess it's happening, we should do something about it, since it's low salience, it's really not on their radar screen. Most Americans, when they look at politics, are kind of the same way I am when I look at soccer. I'm not a soccer fan. I know there's a World Cup. I know Manchester United's pretty good, or they're always pretty good. And I know every once in a while some guy like David Beckham will show up, or there'll be some guy, and then every 4 years they'll play something on ESPN. And I vaguely know, and I might even watch because my wife's Turkish and she comes from a soccer family, and occasionally I'll watch a match or something like that. That's the way most Americans think about politics. And that's why Trump's climate denialism hasn't penetrated the Republican base. I wish I could tell you a different story. Even the Republican base, even the Fox News viewers know that what they're hearing from Michael Lind and Sean Hannity and Rush Limbaugh and Donald Trump and my old friends at Heritage and elsewhere in the ecosystem of the nihilist right is rejected. It's not really. They just don't know. They haven't gotten the cues of what the party line is. So the takeaway here is that if you're in the business of trying to sell concern about climate change, it's not necessarily impossible to do it with Republican or right-of-center audiences. But the trick here is that you're going to get more reception from the relatively less engaged Republican base than you are from the relatively more engaged Republican base because they know where Donald Trump stands on these issues, and they tend to be bought in more firmly. Of course, that's a real puzzle for us because the less engaged Republicans are the ones who count infinitely less than the more engaged Republicans. They're your challenge. So, unfortunately, if you're dealing with those well-engaged people, you're not going to be making much headway because you're telling them something that all of their champions and all their trusted sources are telling them differently. So, where does that leave us? I believe that speaking to elites in the Republican Party is the key to putting wind at our back rather than wind in our teeth. And so at the Niskanen Center, we focus relentlessly on influencing Republican and conservative elites, and the elites which count the most of the political leaders, not necessarily the people who run National Review or anything of the kind. It's the people in elected office. That much we know. And so as a center, we think that moving political leaders in the Republican Party is the key to making it easier to sell mainstream science to the Republican base. Unfortunately, the sociological and psychological literature on climate communications really isn't about elites. It's about a random sample of, a certain group which have been given test questions. And I can tell you from experience that what works with elites is different than what works with non-elites. Unfortunately, we don't really have a whole lot of literature to guide us. So what we're engaged in is sort of an iterative learning by doing process at Niskanen. Happily, I know a little bit about those elites because I was one of them for a very long time, still fancy myself as one. But when I was at the Cato Institute for 23 years, as Ashish notes, I was a climate skeptic. And most of the narratives offered by climate skeptics, I wrote, authored, promoted, argued on television and in the newspapers. There was a time in which I was on Fox News probably twice a week. Did a lot of debating with people like Carl Pope, who's the president of the Sierra Club, John Pasquitando, who's president of Greenpeace USA. Got to know all those fellows. And so I know a little bit about how the climate skeptic world thinks, and I certainly know how Republican politicians think. And we try to apply those lessons that I learned in our work at Niskanen when we're dealing with the Republicans on Capitol Hill. So while I have only a brief amount of time left to me, let me get right to brass tacks, what works and what doesn't. Let me start with what doesn't work. It's a longer list, so we'll get this out of the way. What doesn't work is making the case for massive socioeconomic transformation to address climate change. Now, put aside whether Bill McKibben is right that we need the functional equivalent of a replay of World War II to decarbonize on the pace required to head off the worst of climate change. He may very well. I don't want to get into that argument. But if you lead with that argument with right-of-center audiences, you might as well just stop right now, because that raises the specter of everything they fear about climate change. So I had a field day when I was at Cato cherry-picking phrases out of Al Gore's book, Earth in the Balance. Because in that book, he was given occasion to saying things like, we need to make saving the environment and decarbonizing society the number one organizing principle of civilization. Yeah. Now, he's a more measured guy than that, but he was given to a little bit of purple prose in that book. And most conservatives, at least until Donald Trump anyway, thought that the major overarching obligation of civilization is to protect my rights to life, liberty, and happiness, and to allow me the freedom to live my life as I chose without interference by government. It was not to be corralled in through a forced march and a draft into a Greenpeace activist. So, second, what doesn't work is overstatements with regards to certainty. There are a lot of things we know about climate change. I do not mean to be a skeptic here, but it is important to recognize how much we don't know. So, for instance, equilibrium climate sensitivity, according to the IPCC, with regards to a doubling of background industrial concentrations of greenhouse gases, can be anything between a 1.5 degrees Celsius warming or a 4.5 degrees Celsius warming. That is a massive, massive range. And that's their most likely scenario, 66% chance of happening. That means there's a 34% chance it'll be either less modest or more moderate or far more alarming. That is a huge degree of uncertainty. We don't know what the likelihood of low probability, high impact scenarios might be, like the migration of methane hydrates from the tundra in Siberia. We don't know. The moving of the jet stream due to warming. We don't know. How quickly the West Antarctic ice sheet might break and melt. We don't really know. James Hansen had a paper suggesting it could be within a century. You could see cataclysm and water world scenarios. Most scientists don't think so, but they can't dismiss it as, out of the realm of possibility. There's a lot we don't know, and a lot of this is because this is a one-off experiment. Never before in human history or in paleoclimate history, pre-industrial history, have we ratcheted up concentrations of greenhouse gases at as quick a pace as we are doing today. So we don't really know. And when we know enough to be concerned and alarmed and have reasons to act, so don't get me wrong. But what does not work with Republican audiences or well-informed skeptics is when the narratives about the worst-case scenarios are offered as fact, as certainties, because they're not. And if they're even a little bit schooled in this, they'll know that. Which brings me to my third point. And by the way, it also feeds into narratives that the right loves, which is to point out how environmentalists have played chicken little over and over again and have been wrong. And this just reminds them of this. So, for instance, a lot of conservatives can easily go back and say, well, there was a time when we were told the population growth that would tick off a population bomb and we'd be eating human flesh for food. This was sci-fi in the 70s. There was a tremendous fear about the population explosion, which never really came to pass, right? There was a tremendous fear about the depletion of resources that didn't come to pass. And this just reminds conservatives of doomsaying, and it rubs them the wrong way. And related to that, implying that climate skeptics that you're arguing with are either ignorant of the facts, or that they have low IQ, or that they are bought and paid for by your enemies is guaranteed to get you no hearing whatsoever. That's just common sense on anything. But in this particular case, it's actually quite true. There have been a number of studies which have surveyed highly engaged actors, not non-elites who don't pay a whole lot of attention, but highly engaged, like primary voters. And on the climate arena, they would ask climate skeptics some basic questions about science and the literature just to get a sense for how much they really know about what's going on and what the IPCC is saying and fundamental facts about climate change, and ask the same for highly motivated Democratic primary voters who are also climate activists. And it turns out that the climate skeptics tend to know as much, if not a little bit more, than the climate activists. So how can this be? Because we think that the case is really locked shut. Well, the reality is that people are reasoning creatures, but they use their reason to justify positions they want to take for other reasons. There's motivated cognition in this world. If you're not that smart and not that well educated, it's going to be very hard for you to make a case for climate skepticism. You've got to tie yourself in knots to make that case. I used to do it myself, I know. So it turns out that people who are gunslingers for climate skepticism for a living, they may be duplicitous and they may, not understand the fundamental science very well. I grant you all of that. But generally, it's not that they're low IQ people or they couldn't be in this business in the first place. But it's just also not a good way of convincing people. Another thing that doesn't work is identifying climate action as part of a bundle of the progressivist agenda. Now, this also should stand to reason. You don't want people on the right to accept climate change and therefore be forced to accept everything the Bernie Sanders political campaign. And you would think that this would be obvious, and why I'm even mentioning this, because of course you wouldn't do that. But I want to remind you that a year ago, there was a ballot initiative in the state of Washington, which would impose the steepest carbon price in North America. And in fact, since it was economy-wide, it would arguably be the most ambitious carbon price in the world, in return for using those funds to cut sales taxes and some other corporate taxes in the state of Washington. And it was led by a conservative, semi-libertarian, right-of-center economist named Yoram Bauman, who just became a climate activist. And he said, look, free market capitalism has the solution to our problems. Price carbon, put that price signal in the market, market actors will respond. I don't have to get in a hot debate between nuclear energy proponents and solar energy proponents and people who believe in hydraulic fracking as the golden bullet that'll kill coal. We don't have to have any arguments about that. Markets will sort it all out, right? Now, this was in the state of Washington, very left, a fairly blue state, and yet it was opposed by virtually every environmental organization in the state of Washington because they had alliances with other progressive political actors in the state, and that alliance was built on how you were going to use money from climate action, and they opposed it. Let me give you a quote from Becky Kelly, who is the president of the Washington Environmental Council, and explaining why she couldn't support this ballot initiative, and they allied with Koch Industries and others to shoot it down. Quote, viewing climate change as an environmental body of work is way too limited. It's not really an environmental issue. It's a broad sociological and economic issue. Climate policy is not environmental policy. It is everything policy. Well, there is no quicker way to feed Republican or right-of-center fears that environmentalists are actually just political watermelons. Green on the outside, red on the inside. And that's why they think twice, 3 times, and 4 times about embracing the narratives we tell about science. Because it implies that they have to give up everything that they believe in all sorts of contexts. So that's actually a short list of what doesn't work. There's probably more, but I'll leave it at that. Those are the common things that I see that cause me to grind my teeth from my friends in the climate realist camp. So what does work? First of all, it is human nature, and again, I say this because I don't mean to cast aspersions on my old friends in the center right, but and this works everywhere, it's a universal truth, that the messenger counts more than the message. It does not matter how powerful Paul Krugman will be in the New York Times trying to tell Republicans that tax cut fairies don't come down from the sky and pay for the tax cuts. It doesn't work that way, never has, never will, and have an ocean of evidence. Why? Because he's Paul Krugman. He's not read by conservatives. He's loathed by conservatives. If he says it, it makes my job of trying to tell Republicans that message even harder, because that's the Paul Krugman argument, and he's the great Satan of economics, according to the right. Yet if Greg Mankiw says it, or some other trusted economic authority on the right, it has 50 times more power, because they're given an audience. And so it's very, very important that mainstream climate science and the case for climate action is not exclusively an argument offered by people who the right would look at suspiciously. Now, a lot of this is not the fault of the left. A lot of my friends on the so-called eco-right like to blame Democrats for this. They've made it a really partisan issue. Al Gore's the face of climate change, my God. The reality is the environmental community has repeatedly tried to reach out to center-right actors and mainstream people. It's not as if the left hasn't tried. And so I don't mean to shoot at strategies here. But what I do mean to say is today, If you think that the right way to stop the Trump administration and the Republican leadership in the House and the Senate on their crazy jihad against fundamental science is to double the checks you're writing for Sierra Club or to Bill McKibben or Tom Steyer should just try harder, you're wrong. Because they don't matter right now. Republicans don't listen to them, don't care about them, they can't affect their political prospects, and all it does is make it sound as if climate change is the policy agenda of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. Why would we have a relationship here? So it's important for us to find the right messengers. Second of all, an argument that works with the Republican elites is an argument that worked very well with me, which is that climate change really is a risk management problem. The reality is we don't really know what's going to follow. We know what the more likely scenarios are, but that's not even the relevant question. There is a wide range of possible outcomes. There is a full distribution from happily, not too terribly dramatic, to absolutely cataclysmic. And so as policy actors, we have to deal with all of the possible outcomes. And we have to accept all of these uncertainties, but we have to account for them in our actions. And it turns out, one of the most powerful things I ever heard that was the final straw that moved me from climate skeptic to mainstream climate actor was a meeting I had with a fellow named Bob Litterman. Now, Bob was the risk management director at Goldman Sachs. He was a partner there. He was the first quant on Wall Street. So he's one of the nation's top experts in risk management. And he's also a mainstream climate actor. He's on the board of the World Wildlife Federation and a few other places. Bob came to see me and he said, look, the problems, the risks and uncertainties we face in climate change are not different from uncertainties and risks I face at Goldman in financial markets all the time. We don't know what all these black swans might be. We know they're out there. There are all kinds of things we can't quantify very well. There's a full distribution of possible outcomes. The most likely outcome is not how I act. If I invested based on the most likely outcome every single year, all money goes into equities and we walk away and there is no Goldman Sachs. Nobody does that, right? I mean, we manage risk for, and if you do that, if you accept the full range of possible outcomes, prudence demands that we hedge against those risks, that we at the very least price those risks so they influence the market signals that we're dealing with. And that was very powerful to me, and it worked, and it's very powerful to Republicans because you can then capture it in non-environmental context because that's how Republicans think about a lot of things. I'm going to give you a quote, not that I endorse this quote, but this was widely shared by a lot of Republicans. After 9/11, Dick Cheney was deeply concerned about Pakistan's nuclear capability and whether Pakistan might, or Pakistani science might, move the nuclear technology to al-Qaeda. And he said, quote, if there is a 1% chance that Pakistani scientists are helping al-Qaeda build or develop a nuclear weapon, we have to treat it as a certainty in terms of our response. Well, if you've ever heard a throatier case for the precautionary principle, I'd like to see it. Republicans are risk hedgers and risk managers all the time in all sorts of other contexts. They never blink an eye. And in fact, you know, a lot of people on the right, they kind of fancy themselves as the chesty risk takers, unlike those thumb-sucking liberals who are just afraid of their ghosts. And if we ever listened to them, we'd never have a fire in a cave and we'd still be living as Neanderthals because we never would develop because they're so afraid, you know, they so weight the possibility of error and problem than risk-taking and, you know, chesty capitalism and all what makes humanity great. But in reality, Republicans and other issues become exactly that, right? If there's a 1 in 1,000 chance that some Syrian refugee might be a security risk, then America's under its bed sucking its thumb. The same thing applies with what's the most likely outcome of Iran having nuclear weapons? Well, probably the same thing of India and Pakistan having nuclear weapons. This is the most likely outcome. There are other outcomes that we worry about. So Republicans think this way. Well, we all do in reality. And this is an argument that really appeals. Co-benefits works as an argument. One of the things that's been mentioned in this conference before and will be mentioned again after I'm done, but it's important, is that people care more about conventional air and water pollution and public health than they care about climate change. Because to them, wrongly, they believe climate change is this distant problem for the year 2400, and it just doesn't resonate that much. But when John McCain carried this banner in the GOP successfully in 2008, he did it more effectively than about anybody else I've ever seen. He said, look, Climate change seems to be real, and I think we have to hedge against it, and it represents a dangerous threat. Most scientists think that's the case. They know more than I do. But you know what? What happens if they're wrong? Well, the worst that happens is we leave our planet clean. We give clean air and clean water and a clean climate to our kids. That resonates very powerfully, even, believe it or not, with a lot of Republicans. And finally, what works are solutions to climate change that don't require destroying the free market, that allow us to unleash market forces. I am firmly of the belief that while there are a lot of things in Republican, conservative, libertarian dogma that I'm not particularly comfortable with, which doesn't mean that I'm a Bernie Sanders voter, but I'm not a dogmatic guy. But the one thing I do agree with is that conservatives and libertarians were put on this earth with the perfect toolbox for how best to address climate change. Price the risk, put it in the market, let market actors respond with a robust and increasing carbon price. That is the best way to drive deep decarbonization. And they have the answer. And these are the policies that virtually every economist who studies this issue endorses. These happen to be, happily, policies the progressive left can live with if we can get some sort of truce on how to use the money, which is an entirely separate fiscal matter, has absolutely nothing to do with the climate. Yes, you can use the money in ways that can help advance climate action, adaptation investments, R&D investments. That's all true. Those are separate questions. The more immediate need is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions on a pace that allows us to keep warming from going above 2 degrees centigrade. Carbon pricing is the most efficient way to do that. If you go in another direction and talk about massive decarbonization in a World War III-like mobilization where the government is going to dictate how you use energy and what kind of energy you use in every nook and cranny of your life, and picks out what kind of light bulbs you can use and when you can turn them on and all kinds of things, you will never find conservative support. And let me close by saying finding right-of-center support is absolutely critical. In fact, without it, climate action will never be meaningful, at least in the United States. And the main reason is we have a system of government that makes total victory by one side virtually impossible. Even if you're lucky enough to have 60 votes in the Senate so you can withstand any filibuster from the minority and a majority in the House and the White House and the Supreme Court, and you can somehow pass policy, which policy passes even under those, first of all, those circumstances happen once in a blue moon. But they did happen once under Barack Obama in his first term, and we got the American Care Act, right? And what's its fate? It's dead. Because you got to hold that kind of majority forever, which you will never do. So you need to find a place where you can bring the center-right into partnership with a climate response, which means you will never get everything you want. No one ever gets everything they want in politics or in policy action. But if you hold out for total victory, for the ideal plan as you might see it, and I have my own version of ideal plans, I don't mean to be wagging a finger, but if we do that and we can't relearn the art of compromise and finding some sort of bipartisan approaches, then we are just building policy ideas on sand. The most critical thing is to bring the center-right into this world. I think it can be done because my experience in talking to Republican legislators, including many who you'd be surprised to hear about, because either don't talk about climate ever, even with a gun to their head, or when they do, they sound faintly ridiculous. But when you talk to them privately, most Republican actors in Washington, and by that I mean senior committee staff and senators and congressmen who are fairly famous, will tell you privately they know damn well climate change is happening. And they don't mean by that they're conceding the fact that we have 4 seasons, which is the way Marco Rubio kind of tells it, right? Oh, of course climate's changing. Hell, it was really cold at Christmas and it's really hot on the 4th of July. They mean it for real. They understand it's happening. They're afraid that when they're retired, or they have this lingering fear, that their grandkids are going to ask them why they fiddled while the planet burned when they're in a position to do something about it. And even if they're somewhat conflicted about how serious this problem is, they know that the end point of Republican policy can't be denial. It's not politically sustainable. It has a brief lease on life in this administration, but this administration won't last forever, and it is a passing phase. And that if there is going to be action, which they believe is the case, then would they prefer it to be market action using price signals and allowing us to harness capitalism to solve the problem? Or do you want an endless march of EPA regulation, DOE regulation, regulatory interventions all over the place to micromanage the economy? And they don't want to do that. So they're looking for a way out. So I'll stop right there and look forward to the conversation.
Terry, that was terrific. Anneliese?
Thank you very much, Ashish, and your colleague for organizing these events. And thank you very much, Jerry, for your talk. It's not easy to talk after you, but I will try. So as Ashish said, I am neither a medical doctor nor a climate scientist, but I am a communication information researcher. And I am co-directing the Center Virchow-Villerme. It's a French-German research lab in public health where we carry a lot of work on communication of climate change and health and its health impacts in partnership with Heidelberg University. And we have recorded 3 MOOCs with Rainer Sauerborn on climate change and health. So a key challenge that public health needs to address is communication. How can we communicate effectively prevention messages? How can we make sure that people adopt the right behavior to protect their health? Like public health, climate change is a global issue that requires effective communication. This is the reason why we have taken up this challenge at the Centre Virchow-Villerme and created a research group for sea health to study the communication of climate change and health. So, there's for sea health seeks to bring a European approach on this issue. US-based colleagues at George Mason University or at Yale program on climate communication have shown that public health was a key argument to raise awareness about the impacts of climate change. Framing climate change as a public health concern rather than as an environmental issue is one of the elements that can help better involve the public in engaging with climate change even more than framing it as a risk or a security issue. So far, 4C Health has already produced 4 landmark reviews. These reviews assess the state of our current knowledge about the impacts of climate change on health. They look at the scientific literature, the evolution of legislation, the media coverage, and finally the state of educational programs for health professionals and medical students. So what is the state of reporting on climate change and health in European media? Well, first of all, Fox News is not broadcasted in Europe, so that's already a good start. A leading voice in Europe, in European newspapers, has been The Guardian's, which has raised the awareness of its readers on the issue since 2013. It has been a real editorial decision from the editor, but this remains a rather isolated, albeit remarkable initiative. In France and in Germany, the situation is a bit different. These are the 2 countries where we have analyzed the press coverage of the issue. So, for example, look at our analysis of the coverage in Le Monde, France's leading broadsheet. The 3-decade-long analysis did not show any significant increase in interest in the health aspects of climate change. There has been, however, an evolution of the reporting on the subject. The green curve on the screen represents all articles published in Le Monde since 1990 that contain the term climate change. And then we counted the articles linking up climate change and health, and this is shown in blue on the graph. So the health is mentioned only in a minority of articles reporting on climate change. The issue has clearly gained prominence since 2000. It was mostly addressed through articles on extreme events, infectious disease, migration, and malnutrition. On the media, peaks of activity are typically related to the UNFCCC's Conference of the Parties, or COP. Such major events clearly drive peaks in media coverage. The steadiness of the press coverage of the nexus contrasts with the sharp increase that we observed in the scientific literature. SO's research has considerably expanded on the issue. The media don't talk more about it than before. So how can we improve the coverage of the issue? Shouldn't the psychology of people be better taken into account? This is a key issue. We need to engage with people more actively. People continue to perceive climate change mostly as an environmental issue, as a distant threat. There is a deep psychological distance with regard to geography. The impacts appear far away. Time horizon, they are perceived as a future threat, but also with regard to social classes. People, they will not be affected themselves. So we need to reduce the social distance between the people and the victims of climate change and show people how climate change will also affect them. This is why health can be a very powerful tool to reduce this social distance, and make people feel more concerned about climate change and its impact for themselves as well as for the other. So, how to empower people about what they can do? The last Lancet report on health and climate change recognized that more positive messages should be used, putting the health argument more central. That would also give them the opportunity for leadership and empower citizens, because what is good for your health is also good for the climate. Such call from recognized medical authorities, but such as the World Health Organization, usually have a very strong impact in the media. And as you can see, the Lancet report was reported immediately by Le Monde as a call for action for citizens. Just a quick example from Paris. Before and during the COP21, several exhibitions and posters were disseminated in the city. They sought to engage with the public with relating climate change to their everyday life. This is a clear example of proximity principle. For instance, how will climate change impact Paris in 2050? It is interesting to see that no particular negative words were employed. So the daily heat wave 2003 in France was still a very vivid memory for all Parisians. It was referred to as the summer of 2003. On the left, small avatars have replaced the characters of Eugène Delacroix's famous painting, Liberty Guiding the People. We are now talking of the climate revolution in a clear reference to the French Revolution, a common referential for all French people. The poster reads like a call for action. Thus, it stresses the need for breaking away from the old world. It does not disempower the citizens, quite the opposite. So such campaigns address individuals as citizens with rights and duties, not just as consumers or victims. Communication has an essential role to play in provoking a response to climate change. It must first raise awareness, make people feel involved, and ultimately engage them to take action. To achieve our public health goals, it is important to find out what kinds of messages about climate change are motivating. So some key challenges to overcome. Climate change appears as a very complex issue at the intersection of science and politics, and achieving clarity is really a key. Then consider the principle of proximity. The long-term effects of climate change cannot overshadow the short-term consequences in our communication. Empower people. People often feel powerless in the face of climate change, and negative messages can cause anxiety and apathy. And lastly, show people how to act collectively. Show that the multiplicity of actors can be a catalyst for collective action. Climate change is often presented in a way that can make people feel helpless and useless in the face of the threat. We need to show people how they also act collectively, not just individually, and the power of collective mobilization. So we need to put emphasis on what people are most concerned with, starting with their health. I think there's a lot of we can learn from public health information campaigns, from success story, but also from failure, which messages have worked and which haven't, and that's we are working on at the Centre Virchow-Villerme. We are just at the beginning of the journey here. Thank you.
I'm looking at the moderator of the next panel, and I'm basically saying I'm going to go about 5 minutes over. I hope that's okay. We started a little bit late. And I want to take about 10 minutes for questions. And I want to start off with a question for both of you. Slightly different versions of the same question. which is in November, we had an election in these United States, and on Sunday, there was an election in France. And in neither election did this issue of climate change really come up very much. And if you sit around here today, you might become convinced that this is a really important issue. Sort of almost an existential threat potentially. And there are lots of issues that people are not paying attention to. I mean, most Americans are just trying to get through their day and put food on the table and get their kids to soccer, and they're not worried deeply about any policy issue. And yet there are policy issues that were discussed, at some length in the American election. I have to be honest, I follow the French election a little less closely, but still closely, because there's some very interesting trends happening across Europe. I also didn't see much in the discussion on this. So could each of you begin just by talking about why it hasn't shown up at the time that we had these national discourses in the context of elections? Jerry, any thoughts you want to start?
Well, because other things are more interesting to people than climate change. That's why. Whether we like that or not, or whether that's warranted or not, is sort of immaterial. But the reality is environmental issues rarely dominate American politics, even when it comes to conventional pollutants, which resonate more politically powerfully with people than does climate change. But, we spend a lot of time dwelling on that and bemoaning it. I don't think it's important. George Herbert Walker Bush was elected in 1988 in a campaign against Michael Dukakis, in which he hardly said anything about clean air. In fact, if anything, he said he wanted to be the environmental president. We talked about wetlands. That was his issue, not clean air. And yet the 1990 Clean Air Act legislation was one of the most substantial environmental packages of legislation in 20 years. He didn't campaign on it, but he did it anyway because there's political value to it. I think we often lapse into what I call high school civics. We think that politicians do what the public wants based on public opinion surveys and based what's on their minds, and they respond. And so if we want politicians to act, we think, well, we have to make sure the public visibly wants this and that they demand it, and we can see that evidence in polls, and we can see campaign behavior that reflects it. And the reality is that is absolutely not true. Most people, at least in the United States, and I'm going to venture to say in other Western democracies as well, know virtually nothing about politics, care virtually nothing about politics. Public opinion surveys which allegedly ascertain their views are easily mistaken. There was a survey done by a firm last year that asked Republicans and Democrats whether they favored bombing Agrabah. And there were large numbers that had opinions. Very few people had no opinion. This is a make-believe country. It's from Aladdin. It doesn't exist. And yet you had firm opinions about war with a make-believe Disney country. And I don't mean to say that. This is not a function that most people are stupid. What it is an observation is that most people care 1/1000th of what people in this room probably care about politics about. No more than I care about world soccer. And so if you want to drive political action, to do it at a retail level, to try to change that reality, which is a reality which covers all issues, and you're going to change it in the one which is also one of the least salient to them, good luck. I don't think that's the right way to go. And I don't think so. The observation shouldn't probably disturb us very much. There are other routes to policy change.
And how do you really feel, Jerry?
So in France, despite the absence of green candidates in this election, environmental issues took a bit more importance than usual. And as often in France, the debate on climate change turned out to be mostly about nuclear energy. The poll's favorite, Emmanuel Macron, wants to reduce the size of nuclear energy by 50% by 2055. So in the country of the world that is the most dependent of nuclear energy, it's Copernican revolution. So we will see. Another major change seems to be the conversion of the left to environmental issue. Both Jean-Luc Mélenchon, extreme left candidates, and Benoît Hamon, the candidates of the Socialist Party, present themselves as ecologists. So it's interesting turning point. And environmental health was also rather prominent in the two candidates' manifestos. Both want to forbid pesticides, and Hamon made of the prohibition of endocrine disruptors a major issue in his campaign.
Okay, great. Yes.
My question is for Jerry, and it's about the idea of using risk management as a way to appeal to center-rightists. But isn't it more about what's behind the perceived risk? Whereas if the example of Dick Cheney, for example, is the 001 Syrian percentage allowed, permitted the use of perpetuated war and black hole prisons, and there was a motive to saying who's going to be hypervigilant about the zero chance of a Syrian, whereas with climate change, whatever the risk perceived is, it seems to be a threat to the right of liberty and health, happiness, and pursuit of happiness, and as well as a threat to unbridled capitalism. So I'm just thinking, isn't it more about what's behind the perceived risk than the aversion to risk?
For some. I mean, obviously for some. If you are absolutely convinced that climate change is junk science cooked up by socialists that is being used to finally put the death throes to capitalism, and everyone who's a climate-concerned actor is Naomi Klein, then yes, there's no conversation about risk management. They don't think there's any risk to manage. And that's certainly true. And it's also true that there is a faction of the right that believes that any constraint on capitalist activity is an abomination, not because they were paid to say that. There are people on the right who believe that the greatest engine for human well-being has been the wealth creation that capitalism produces. So any constraint upon that is retarding the one thing which we know is the greatest avenue for human well-being. So yeah, you're absolutely right. But that's not how most feel. Most Republican elites that I deal with do not share these extreme views. The gunslingers may. Some of my old friends at the Cato Institute and other parts of the libertarian world may. But I don't know if I need to clue you into this, but libertarians are not particularly important. They're just not. They have like 2 legislators. They represent 5% of the public. They're not. Most people, even in the Republican Party, would be very, very careful about saying clean water and clean air aren't important, and that risks in climate don't even exist. In fact, you're starting to see more and more acknowledgement that there's a lot of uncertainty in climate science. Now, you might think, oh my gosh, that's kind of a cover for the right not to act. But in a sense, it's an opening, because at least it's not the militant certainty that this is all a hoax. And if you believe that there's a 1%, if there's a 1% chance that Al-Qaeda could get the bomb, then we have to act. What if there's a 10% chance that the planet is going to experience a Great Depression-like economic result from climate change? And in fact, that is the opinion in the peer-reviewed economics literature. When the people who published in that literature were surveyed, what are the chances of a 25% reduction in GDP output by 2100 from a 3C warming? That would give you 5 or 10% GDP loss. About 15% of the economists said, yeah, there's a chance of that happening. So that resonates. Not with everyone. Won't resonate with Charles Koch maybe, but he's not a senator, so it doesn't matter.
Up there, yeah.
So this is also for Jerry, but the question is basically, so I buy the argument that, okay, we need to convince the center-right to do something about climate and maybe focus less on the climate-convicted left. And I also buy the argument that it's the Republican elites that need to do something about it. I fully believe you that there are Republican elites that want to do something about it, but they're currently not. And they're currently not, probably because they face potential risk of primary challenges if they do speak out about it. So how do we move from where we are on that to then actually getting them to speak out? And you said, okay, you know, it's really about the messenger. Who are these messengers, and how can we convince them to actually join the side of doing something about climate?
Well, there are at present a handful of them. I'm one of them. Former Congressman Bob Inglis is another. There are other actors on the eco-right that bravely try to talk to Republicans on the Hill, but there are fewer of us than we'd like.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah, and that's exactly right. See, the reason that things have changed in the GOP was the arrival of the Tea Party. Prior to the Tea Party, because there's this fantasy that is sometimes offered in leftist circles that it's oil, gas, and coal that owns the GOP, and they'd take huge wealth loss if we act against climate change, and it's their control of the party that prevents action. It's a nice thought. It kind of fits into a lot of left of center morality plays, but the reality is in 2008, it's not like oil, gas, and coal didn't exist, and McCain still got the nomination, and the GOP still wrote a platform that Sheldon Whitehouse could have written, and had, in a different world, John McCain won that election, we would have a very different conversation right now, because we would have an aggressive climate policy. We'd have a more aggressive climate policy than Europe has ended up adopting, had that kind of a cap-and-trade regime gone through. And it would have happened, I firmly believe, if he would have won that election, because he would have brought enough Republicans in to support that, just as George Bush did with the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. So the problem was that the Tea Party ends up capping through primaries Bob Inglis, and then everybody goes silent in the GOP because they don't want that kind of a primary challenge. It wasn't oil, gas, and coal that put the conversation to a stop. It was the Tea Party. Now, the happy thing, there's not too many happy consequences that I can say that follow from November, but this is one of them. Whatever else you might want to say about Donald Trump, he absolutely destroyed the pre-existing power structure within the GOP, which was held like a death grip by a handful of actors, including those which were behind the Tea Party. And most of the Tea Party ended up defecting from Americans for Prosperity and Freedom Works and the other establishment groups that were kind of, I'd call, you know, hardcore, super right. And they ended up going to to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump didn't believe a lot of what the Tea Party ostensibly believed in, yet they defected to him. So the operative question going forward is, can Donald Trump deploy these actors like, say, the Koch operations were able to do so for 8 years? I don't know. He doesn't look that competent to me. And it takes real competence to run an operation like that. So I'm skeptical. And I'm also skeptical they care enough to do it. I mean, this is a low salience issue that works to our advantage. Are Republican primary voters really going to knock out a candidate entirely because of climate change? And if you ask Bob Inglis, he lost that seat for a lot of reasons. Climate was just one of them. It wasn't even the main reason.
Last question. Go ahead, and then we'll wrap up.
This is for Jerry and Anneliese. Right now, the United States subsidizes fossil fuel and coal at $700 billion per year. What would your argument be of to communicate, perhaps incrementally decreasing that subsidy, allocating it to something else, and letting the market prevail to get the fossil fuel industry to innovate in ways unprecedented?
Well, when you're in the business of trying to quantify fossil fuel subsidies, we find ourselves kind of in a swamp. So, for instance, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, in their latest report posited that global fossil fuel subsidies were only $320 billion last year, globally. So there's obviously a difference of definition between, say, what the IEA does and wherever your $700 billion figure came from. Yeah, if you're including externalities, it can get kind of high. Now, remember, most Republicans don't believe there are any externalities to fossil fuel consumption, so you get a real problem there. And the second problem you get is that people like subsidies, right? Because it means lower cost something for consumers. We subsidize renewable energy, and if we didn't, its costs would be higher. If we didn't subsidize fossil fuels, in most of the cases it doesn't reduce prices. There's some really good arguments from economists on this, but sometimes it does. And even if it doesn't reduce consumer prices, you can tell the story that it does. How many people are sophisticated enough economically to know that these are inframarginal rents and, you know, some conversation like that. So I don't think it really helps this debate one way or the other. The best that can be done is to use that evidence, use that information as a rationale for why we need to continue to help renewable energy with government favor. Simply because it's tipping the scales so heavily towards fossil fuels with existing policy that other preferences, just level the playing field as opposed to try to distort markets, which is the way the conservatives tend to hit that.
I agree with you, Jerry, and I'm not so specialist in this domain to give more details on this issue.
Well, let's since we're a little over time, let me go ahead and turn it over to the next panel. But let's take a moment to thank both of these terrific speakers. That was fantastic. Thank you.